Hi everyone. This week for the class notes, I want to really focus on where we're at with the semester. We're approaching now the halfway point, and so looking back over what we've read so far and thinking ahead to the midterm exam really is going to be our focus for the work that we're doing coming up here. So with that in mind, the notes will focus sort of more on how you should be thinking about and framing the first half of the semester and preparing for the the midterm exam, and a little bit less on Paradise Lost, although I'll use some examples from that as well as other things we've read as we go along here. So, first, what's really self-evident and something that I alluded to at the start of the semester is the fact that in a course like this, what we're really doing is we're compressing down literary history. The great advantage, right, of a course like this one is getting a panoramic view of literary history. So you get this nice big view, but in spending just one semester reading through some selected primary texts as if they alone could represent British literary traditions, we benefit from being able to be thinking actively about works of literature that in reality were published across over a millennium. So obviously, if we had world enough in time, we could read all these authors, really important authors that we really should be reading. And and putting this course together, I had to make choices about what we're going to read, what we weren't going to read, and we're reading just a tiny fraction of what we could be reading. I mean, you could see that even in our textbook. So I tried to pick things that I thought were really representative of certain periods in literary history, especially important literary texts. But had I made a different set of choices, we would have gotten a slightly different view of this history. So that all said, given what we are reading, the advantage of doing this is that over the course of just a little bit of time, really in real time, we're covering so much actual historical time. So that gives you sort of a nice view. You can make connections that maybe you couldn't make if we were focusing in on a much narrower time frame or reading much more. So we're at the midway point this week, so we'll have reached the halfway point of the reading, so now is a good time to reconsider what we have read so far. So that's what the purpose of the midterm exam is. It's not just an opportunity to demonstrate your learning, but a chance to truly take stock of what we've read and make some connections between texts that just reading them from week to week doesn't always allow us to do. So what follows then are some ideas you should be thinking about and perhaps even taking some preliminary notes on in preparation for the exam. So I want you to think about this in terms of connections. So the first thing you should be thinking about is connecting the ideas of communities. One way to think about what we've read up through the end of this week is to think in terms of communities, of the groups of people that have come together for different purposes. Some small, like a wandering band of pilgrims. Some large, like an army of fallen angels. Some enormous, like the Geats and the Danes. As I've been emphasizing all semester long, you should be considering some of the different communities you've encountered in the primary texts that we've read. How do they function? What internal rules, values, rituals, behaviors, and so on define them? What internal divisions can we see within these communities? Who is allowed in and who isn't? And how are the borders of the community policed or controlled, if they are at all? Consider, for instance, the community of the fallen angels in Paradise Lost. Why does Milton represent them in such detail? What is Satan's relationship to the other fallen angels? What is their role in the larger cosmos? Why are they thrown out of heaven? Right? All of these questions have to do with notions of community and notions of belonging. And so Paradise Lost is a really nice example of what we've been looking at all semester long, which is ideas of different kinds of communities, how they operate, who's in them, who isn't, what their purpose is. Another kind of connections you should be making have to do with values. So what are some of the key values you see expressed and embodied by characters in each of the texts that we've read? Do you see parallels amongst any of the characters from different primary texts? So this week's discussion board prompt should help you think about connections you see between Satan and some of the past characters that we've read about. What values do you see changing across these texts? We've already covered about 800 years of literary history, and so clearly a lot can change in that time. So how do you see concepts like heroism, camaraderie, monstrosity, sacrifice, avarice, marriage, the public self, honor, knowledge, rule-breaking, treated in different primary texts? And that's just a very short list of some of the different kinds of values that we've been discussing. What values seem to stay the same or become more complex while still adhering to certain core ideals? So you should really be thinking in particular about this idea of different characters embodying different sets of values. And you can see that in something like Beowulf, it's very obvious there that we have a character being set up as someone who is, in many ways, a model of heroic virtues and values that we should be admiring and that we should ourselves want to embody. But once you get into the Canterbury Tales, it becomes much more complicated. So with Canterbury Tales, with Othello, and with Paradise Lost, we have central characters, we have protagonists that are ambiguous because it's unclear to what degree they're embodying values that we should admire and to what degree they are flawed characters who represent characteristics that we want to avoid. And that's complex. Sometimes the same character might be more than one thing, right? As we see, for example, perhaps with Othello, perhaps even with Iago. In Paradise Lost, we think of Satan as the ultimate evil, and yet there are many who say that Satan is himself the hero in some ways, the protagonist of Paradise Lost, the character that we most end up rooting for, that we sort of most identify with. Now, we don't really get as much of a sense of that since we're only reading book one, but you really see that when you read the full trajectory of all the books of that larger epic. So another kinds of connections that we should be looking for are connections about difference. So how are various forms of difference represented in each of the primary texts? How do ideas about gender difference, to take a primary example, help to structure the different communities and forms of social relationships in each of the texts that we've read? So how are the Wife of Bath and Alison from the Canterbury Tales, for instance, alike and unlike the three primary female characters in Othello? What about other forms of difference, like religious affiliation, racial identity, national allegiance, or class status? So that's something we've been talking about a lot so far, and something I want us to continue thinking about is how do these forms of difference manifest themselves? How are they represented? How does that change across time? Do you see continuity across time? What parallels can we find between characters who are outsiders for various reasons? So what might Grendel, or the Miller, or Othello, or Satan have in common, for example? In what ways do these characters diverge? And again, this week's discussion board post will hopefully help you think about this specific grouping of characters. Connecting literary genres and aesthetics. So far, everything we've read is written, for the most part, in poetic form, even though the particular genre and style of each primary text does indeed vary. The only material that we've really read in terms of the primary text that isn't in poetic form is some parts of Othello are written in prose. Some characters, there are some scenes where they speak in prose form. But almost everything we've read basically is in some form of poetry, right? Even if it's a long epic, it's still written in a poetic form. So what can you observe about the changing use of genre across the text that we've read? So if we're reading, a grand national epic like Beowulf, or if we're reading a set of interlocking tales, as we are with the Canterbury Tales, or a play like Othello, or again, another kind of, here sort of like cosmic epic, as we're seeing with Paradise Lost. So what do you notice about use of language, of syntax, of form? You might pay attention to things like the use of meter, of rhyme, of alliteration, of other sorts of poetic devices within the different texts that we're looking at. What artistic principles seem to underlie each of the texts that we've read? So that's what aesthetics really means. It's just sort of like the principles of art that seem to be assumed by the text. And sometimes an artist or writer will make those explicit, make their ideas about art and writing explicit, and sometimes they won't. But either way, a piece of writing always is written with certain assumptions about the purpose of that piece of writing and the purpose of language and the relationship between the author and the reader and what matters in the world. So what kinds of characters matter in each? What kinds of people are being focused on? That tells you a lot about the author's perspective on the world and the perspective of the role of writing in the world. How does each text represent the idea of character and what character actually means? What is the role of the storyteller, speaker, or narrator in each text? In a lot of these, sometimes we have a narrator who's speaking. Sometimes that narrator is a character in the story. Sometimes we have characters in the stories who are themselves kinds of storytellers. Even, for example, Iago, you could see as a kind of storyteller. Beowulf is definitely a storyteller. We see a lot of storytelling, obviously, in Canterbury Tales. Same thing with Paradise Lost. We have this character Satan, who one of his powers is his ability to persuade the other fallen angels. So language, people who can talk, tell stories, manipulate language, that's a really powerful theme that we see running through everything that we've read so far. What seems to be the relationship envisioned between the story told in the text and the real world? So, for example, think about in Beowulf that we have this kind of mythic epic, right, with monsters in it. So what does that mean? What is that implying about the relationship between that story and the real world? Or in the Canterbury Tales, we talked about that it would be very unrealistic for all these characters to be traveling together in one group. And yet it's a kind of fiction that Chaucer wants us to believe in. So why is that? And what does that imply about the relationship between those tales and reality? How does the text relate to its audience? And what assumptions does the author of each text seem to be making about his readers and audience members? What do they assume that we know? What do they assume that we're familiar with? What do they assume that in terms of how we're going to respond emotionally to certain parts of the story? So finally, sort of shifting forward now as you think about the midterm exam, some things that you should be doing to prepare to take that midterm is you should review the class notes documents. Some of them are focusing on reading skills, on specific writing skills, but in most of them, I'm also talking about some specific issues relevant to the primary texts, or also sort of big themes that I want you paying attention to, so that might be useful is to go back and look at some of those. Review your own notes that you've taken on the primary text and the introductory and preparatory materials about the authors in British history. I definitely would at least look back over some of the material about British history, just so it's kind of fresh in your mind about, oh, okay, right, these are sort of the big moments in medieval history. All right, here's the most important stuff that happened in the 14th and 15th centuries. All right, here's the most important stuff in the 16th century. So you can really sort of refresh yourself up through the early 17th century and kind of at least have that basic overview of that history fresh in your head so you can make some references to it in the exam. You should take some notes based on the connections emphasized in this week's class notes document. So as you're reading through this or listening to it, you might want to then go back in and just jot down a few ideas you have. You might say, oh wait, thinking about this kind of connection made me think about this character in this one, or maybe think about the setting in this scene of this play, and then the setting in this story in the Canterbury Tales. Write down some of your thoughts, your initial thoughts, because those might prove very useful. Consider a few crucial passages from the primary texts that are especially illuminative of some of the connections you see between the primary texts. So think about maybe some parts of the different texts that jump out at you. You might want to go back and skim back over them. Hopefully you took some notes on them and you can look back at that. You might say, oh wait, this is a really important passage or moment that I would want to talk about if I was going to discuss this kind of connection. So note those passages. Don't just look at them, but physically separate them out. Use sticky notes, bookmarks, fold down the pages. If you want to make a list of all these possible passages you want to talk about, you could do that. But just make it easy so that when you sit down to do the exam, you already have a reference source of passages you might want to discuss in the process of making the kinds of connections we're talking about. And then finally, attend the live chat. Excuse me. Attend the live chat to ask questions and discuss key concepts. As always, we can use this live chat to answer whatever questions you guys have, but I really like to use the upcoming live chat to focus in on getting ready for that midterm exam.